Hello everybody, welcome to the case studies webinar on how the Paula tribe and the Yavapai Apache Nation developed and used their respective ETEPs. I'm Josh Simmons. I'm here with Shasta Gaughen from the Paula Band of Mission Indians and David Lewis from the Yavapai Apache Nation. I'll introduce them a little more in just a moment. So we're going to start off with some presenter introductions, and then after those introductions, I'm going to share my perspective on ETEPs, including what the goals and benefits of an ETEP can and what I believe they should be for a tribal environmental office. I'm going to describe the process that I went through in developing the Paula Environmental Departments and Yavapai Apache Environmental Protection Departments, EPA-Tribal Environmental Plans. So you're going to see these acronyms come up. PED means Paula Environmental Department, and YANEPD means Yavapai Apache Nation Environmental Protection Department. I'm then going to describe the process and steps of implementing that I'm going through with Shasta and Dave in implementing their respective EPA tribal environmental plans. Then we're going to hear from Shasta. She's going to provide some feedback on how the development process and implementation process for her ETEP is going. We'll also hear from Dave after that on how it's been going from him as well. I'm going to talk about some of the available ETEP services and trainings offered through Prosper Sustainably and briefly discuss some of the benefits in working with Prosper Sustainably. At the end, there'll be an opportunity for participant questions, so you can feel free to ask questions about your ETEPs, ask questions about the process, ask questions for myself, Dave, or Shasta. And then at the very end, there's going to be a post-webinar survey, and I hope that you'll take time to complete that. So I ask that you just actually keep the webinar window open, and then when I end the webinar, it'll automatically direct you to the survey. I'm going to hold questions to the end, mainly because it's difficult for me to pay attention to the questions, but I see many of you've already identified where you can ask questions. You can type in questions at the very end. I also, if you raise your hand, there's an option to raise your hand. I can also unmute you and ask questions, but we're going to save all questions to the very end. I do encourage you to type in your questions throughout the webinar, and then I'm going to read the questions at the end, and then we'll answer any questions that come up. So please participate. And as I mentioned too, those that register for the webinar are going to receive free versions or free copies of the ETEP templates. So there's 4 different versions. There's 2 spreadsheet versions and 2 Word-based versions. Those will be emailed to you within the next few days following the webinar. All right, so as I mentioned, I have Shasta Gaughen and Dave Lewis with me. So Shasta is with the Paula Band of Mission Indians, specifically the Paula Environmental Departments, which I'm going to refer to as PED for short. She has been the director and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for 6.5 years. You're going to learn a bit more about what she's working on as we go through the presentation today. Also have David Lewis here with the Yavapai Apache Nation. He's with their environmental protection departments. Dave has been working as environmental manager for 3 out of the last 7 years. And then myself, Josh Simmons with Prosper Sustainably. I am Prosper Sustainably's principal consultant and attorney and also its founding president. Prior to starting Prosper Sustainably, I was the Santa Ynez Chumash Environmental Offices Director with the Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Indians. I did that for about 7 years. That's kind of where I began to cut my teeth on developing strategic planning and management systems, which is what you'll see this ETEP looks like, or how I approach the ETEP development implementation process. So some relevant experience. I've completed 5 ETEPs for various tribes so far. There are some additional ETEPs in progress with other tribes right now. I'm going to talk more about my work with Paula and Yavapai Apache Nation in just a moment, where we're at. I've also done both in-person ETEP trainings and online trainings as well. I think I mentioned that. But some of the in-person ETEP trainings, I did one workshop with the Owens Valley Indian Water Commission back in September 2015, I want to say, and then also with the Intertribal Council of Arizona. Both of those were paid for by those organizations. They brought me in to present to tribes that are either part of their consortiums or that were invited to their workshops. We had pretty good showings for both of those. There have been some opportunities to attend some of my workshops and presentations at no charge. So I was at last year's Tribal Lands and Environment Forum, which is hosted by ETEP. I don't typically go to those. I went last year because it was in my hometown, so I was able to fly back. Occasionally I go to the EPA Region 9 annual conferences. I'm based in California, but I do work with tribes all across the country. If I have time to, I will make a trip out to the annual conference. I think last time I went was in 2015. I didn't go this past year. I've also developed and am offering a comprehensive online ETEP training course. I'll share more about that a little later on. Many of you probably have heard about that. Some of you have joined the course. There's a fee-based course. There's a registration fee. Again, I'm going to share more with what's involved in that course toward the end of this webinar. I've also been involved in developing gap guidance training for project officers, working with the American Indian Environmental Office out of EPA's headquarters in DC. That work has been ongoing. Lastly, before we proceed, I want to share this disclaimer, especially in light of the work that I'm doing with the tribes and other agencies and organizations. So I want to state that this workshop is being hosted by Prosper Sustainably, which is a for-profit business that offers a wide range of consulting, legal, and collaborative strategy services to individuals, governments, businesses, nonprofits, tribes, and other communities/organizations. This workshop is not sponsored or endorsed by the US EPA or any other agency and should not be considered a representation of the EPA's opinions in any way. So I just want to be absolutely clear that this is something that I'm independently offering on my own, not associated with the EPA. This is not endorsed by the EPA. This is not a process that they're endorsing specifically. It says in the GAP guidance that the ETEPs are supposed to be flexible. They're not actually, according to the GAP guidance, allowed to even promote a particular approach to ETEPs. So this is just one particular approach. All right, so before getting into the goals and benefits, I just want to briefly talk about my work with the Apollo Environmental Department and the Yavapai Apache Nation Environmental Protection Department. I've worked with Shasta and her staff in developing the PEDs ETEP beginning in fiscal year 2015. I think we began in spring. I've been working with them since on developing and implementing the strategic planning and management system that operates through their EPA-Tribal Environmental Plan, primarily through the Tribal Environmental Plan portion of that, and you'll see more about that in a moment. I worked with Dave and his staff, the YANEPD staff, on their ETEP beginning in fiscal year 2016, primarily last summer, and have continued to work with them in implementing their ETEP and their complementary strategic planning and management system we developed. So I'm continuing that work into this fiscal year as well. All right, so there's ETEP, that's the EPA Tribal Environmental Plan. I also may refer to a TEP or the Tribal Environmental Plan portion of it. So the TEP is really the tribe's responsibility. The E portion of it, the EPA responsibilities, are something that are really more outside the scope of what I work on directly. And I think that 95% of your work, if not more, is going to be focused on the TEP portion of it. I will also refer to as a TEP as an ETEP strategic work plan, or essentially the whole system that I'm developing. I've been referring to it as an ETEP strategic work plan. I do talk about and share some of what the EPA portion of it and how we've reviewed that together and how we've finalized the full ETEP during this case study webinar. It should be the goal of a tribe to develop a TEP that is actually an invaluable strategic planning and management system that will help the Tribal Environmental Department achieve its environmental goals in the most efficient and effective manner possible. So this really can and should be a living and adaptable tool that the Tribal Environmental Department will use on an ongoing basis to guide its operations and decision making. I only feel that I have been 100% successful if the tribes that I work with would want to use a Prosper Sustainably designed ETEP strategic work plan that contains a system of goals and objectives to guide their department's operations, even if ETEPs were not required by the EPA. So if there was no gap guidance, there was no ETEP requirements, if you saw this system, you would want to implement it anyway. So that's really my ultimate goal. That is the highest compliment. That shows that it's of true value to tribal environmental departments. So now we're getting into the meat of the webinar, the process and steps of developing the PEDs and YANEPDs ETEPs, primarily the Tribal Environmental Plan portion of it. The following steps are those that I went through with the Apollo Environmental Department and the Yavapai Apache Nation Environmental Protection Departments in developing their respective ETEPs. I want to make a quick note and state that this webinar isn't going to focus on ETEP requirements or specifically how the PEDs or YANEPDs ETEPs met those requirements. And those requirements I'm talking about are the requirements of the GAP guidance. These ETEPs do meet those requirements. I'm just not going to talk specifically about that. I've given plenty of trainings on how to meet those requirements and how the system meets those requirements. So I think it'll just be more useful and more efficient with our time just to focus on what we actually worked on. So again, Shasta and Dave, feel free to cut in at any time if you have anything to add as I describe these steps. The first step, and really an ongoing step, was gathering and reviewing relevant internal and external information and data sources. This usually began with an information request. I'm pulling up a sample information request right here. I actually had this one, a sample is available as part of the training course. But this is an email that both Shasta and Dave saw something like, where it asks for various types of documents that may contain information that could be incorporated into their EPA-Tribal Environmental Plan. And really the EPA-Tribal Environmental Plan, or the ETEP Strategic Work Plan, is a centralized location for all the tribe's information. So, you can go to this as one-stop shopping for all of your programs, and it also shows what you're going to be working on for the next 4 years. I'll go through the things I asked for and how I use them in a few minutes, but this document kind of shows some of the things I requested. So including work plans, resource management plans, land use and strategic plans. I asked for lists of operations, buildings, businesses, fleets. These things are all related to the environment or have an environmental impact. So we would want to develop or may want to develop goals and objectives relating to these. One pretty helpful thing, so this is jumping a little bit ahead in the process, but through that process of gathering all these documents, so I'll ask for certain documents, and a lot of times the tribes I'm working with aren't really sure whether they had those documents. Maybe something that was developed in the past, and they have to retrieve them, and they find, oh, we didn't know that we had an environmental inventory. It was done 10 years ago. One thing that we've integrated into these ETEP strategic work plans, primarily we work off of a spreadsheet, has been this document list. On my side, when I submit a request to Shasta or Dave, I ended up keeping my own list of what I requested and when. I would identify whether I've reviewed it or, whether I've requested it, whatever it was. So 2 requests, something like that. And then I would indicate the location. I would also have the dates of when I requested and expected it. And then as I was getting to, in just a moment, actually, let me just show you real quick. I would end up getting a pretty extensive file of documents. So this is the client files that I have with the Paula band. A lot of documents that I went through, mainly scanned them. This process is just kind of parsing out the goals and objectives. So I'd open a document, scan through it, and find the relevant information, which I'll describe in the process. As I mentioned, then retrieving all these documents, that's valuable information to have for a tribal environmental department. Is like, what documents do we have? What's the status of these documents? Where are they located? So eventually, with both Paula and Yavapai Apache Nation, we developed and integrated into their ETEP strategic work plans these inventories of documents, where it basically states the document itself, the program area or areas it's related to, what's the status of the document, the authors, what's the latest version year, and then what's the projected update year, and then we can add location and comment. So we're fleshing these things out as well, but that's an example of how this system can kind of help your department be more organized, and how going through this process can help you identify information sources and organize those for future use. So one thing I do want to point out and pull up the YANEPD's plan as well. So we have the inventory of documents. One thing that Dave asked me to do was also integrate a map into their ETEP strategic work plan as well. So there's a tab within their spreadsheet that has a relevant map that they can refer to without having to open that from a separate file. Putting files like this make the spreadsheet a bit larger, so you want to limit how many images you put in there, but I think adding in an image or two or map or two can be helpful. From there, we then determined the priority program areas. So I took my initial review of those documents, made notes, probably began fleshing out. So all these steps are happening simultaneously, but the next kind of key step was determining the priority program areas. In the case of the Paula bands, this is the list of the priority program areas we came up with. Air, environmental emergencies, there's a general category. So I believe there's about, 14 different priority program areas. Under each of these priority program areas is where all of the goals and objectives are organized. But before even proceeding with that, we had to identify what those were. So I would review the documents, make some initial recommendations, and talk to Shasta and Dave about what they felt were appropriate and what are the appropriate names for the program areas. Sometimes they align with the grant programs. In most cases, I think they're different. There's a water category, which would include Clean Water Act 106 and 319 objectives, as opposed to having a 319 program area and a 106, because they overlap. Obviously, there's other overlap here as well, but I prefer to focus on media rather than grant programs for these. How you choose to proceed with that is obviously up to you. So one thing I want to point out is that the PED's ETEP, there are not only programs that are outside the scope of what the EPA funds, but also some non-environmental programs. So the Paula Environmental Department also is its TIPO. So Shasta is the tribe's TIPO as well, and they manage cultural resources. So there is a program area within their ETEP strategic work plan focused on that. So there's goals and objectives for this program. And then let me open up Yavapai Apache Nation's Environmental Department program areas as well. So Dave's plan has about 9 priority program areas. So he has less. His department is smaller than the Paula environmental departments. I believe Shasta, your staff is 8 or 9 or so, and you can share that later. Dave has kind of 3 main office staff members and I believe 3 field staff members. So less programs, but tribal environmental departments are of all different sizes. So this can and should be customized to meet each tribe's specific program areas and reflect those environmental and non-environmental, those funded by the EPA and those that aren't funded by the EPA. So for example, you may have a tribal wildlife grant and you'd want to have those goals and objectives in this ETEP strategic work plan as well. All right, so after determining the priority program areas, we then prepare the ETEP strategic work plan spreadsheets. So these are the templates we worked off of. So let me pull open the PEDs. And so I left some of the information in here and then I deleted the rest of it. So really there's the description of the priority program areas. Then there are the long-term program area goals. So there's a table box for that. As you can see, we did these in spreadsheets. There's different versions you can use as well. I'll be sharing those templates of different versions. I advocate a spreadsheet, and even people who don't use Excel have found that they prefer this approach as well. So this is the bulk of the plan. This is the objectives table, the annual objectives or intermediate program development milestones. These are customizable, so there's a lot of columns in here, some of which we are using, many of which we are not necessarily using, and they can be changed as well. So you'll start to see what's actually in these when we start showing the examples in just a moment. But some of these automatically populate, so the staff member responsibilities actually automatically populate in the combined responsibilities. You could use this to, if you're using it to develop work plans, you could start entering hours, which then will automatically convert into work years. And then you could track funding sources. So apologize if I'm making you all dizzy. So you can track if you've secured funding, how much funding, you can make notes. So again, customizable. I don't expect most of my clients don't only use probably 25% or less of this particular table. But again, it's just, it's for you to customize how you see fit to make sure you have the information that you want. And Dave in particular has actually been particularly aggressive in maximizing the use of this particular document. And I believe he's getting the most out of it. Scroll down to the next table. So here are the plans to manage authorized EPA programs. So these are where the tribe is going to assume some delegable responsibility from the EPA to administer an EPA statutory program or a federal environmental statutory program under one of the federal environmental statutes. And in this table, it's more of an indication of whether there are any plans or not. The actual plans themselves are within the objectives table. So if the tribe is pursuing TAS for water quality standards, this would say that yes, please see objectives, and then under the objectives, you would see the objectives to pursue and develop tribal water quality standards under TAS. These plans are also meant to be 4-year plans, always covering the next 4 years. So I have the word perpetually in there because if you develop a plan right now, you'd probably have it begin at this point. You may have it cover this year. You may have it choose to cover beginning in fiscal year 2018. If that was the case, then you have fiscal year 18, 19, 20, and 21. And then when you're near the end of fiscal year 2018, you'd want to update your plan and you'd archive the fiscal year 2018 objectives, and then you'd add objectives for fiscal year 2022 on the back end. So your plan is always going to cover the next 4 years. And that's how your plan always stays relevant, always stays useful, and it's how you avoid having to do major updates as well. All right, so the next major step, and this was the bulk of the work, was drafting the intermediate objectives / milestones per program area. And these are annual objectives. So it's not quite always at the task level you may see in a work plan, like a GAP work plan or a 319 work plan. Sometimes those are annual objectives. Sometimes those are more steps and kind of sub-objectives. So you'll see more of those in just a moment. One of the first things that I did is extracted some objectives from past, current, and future work plans. This is actually probably the key part of it because you actually have a lot of objectives already. You're already committed to objectives for at least 1 year out, if not 2 years out. So you want to start here in developing your EPA or your ETEP strategic work plan, and that's what we did, both Shasta, Dave, and I, working on their respective plans. So one thing I like to do is review the past work plans. So in working with Dave last summer, I looked at his past 2 years worth of work plans to see what he was working on and also see whether there was anything that needed to be carried over. So I'd scan through, look at his commitments, and see if they're on schedule. This also has a report. If something seems to be behind or may not actually be done, then I ask them about it, or I also just ask them, okay, well, are all of your commitments going to be accomplished? And if not, are any of them going to carry over? Because if they are going to carry over into the following fiscal year, then we'd want to incorporate them into the plan. Then I extracted objectives from the current and future work plans. The current work plan, if you are going to include the current work plan in your ETEP strategic work plan, the future one definitely, because that's going to be either the first year or the second year in your work plan. So last summer, this was still fiscal year 2016. Dave had a copy of his fiscal year 2017 work plan. I went through that, and this provided essentially the first year of his plan. So I went through here and I basically translated these components and the commitments into annual objectives. I try to make them annual objectives at a higher level instead of not really making them kind of sub-objectives where there's multiple steps to accomplishing something. And so I did that for all of his work plans. So we have, there's GAP. Here's his 106 work plan. We pulled out the objectives here as well. So in here you can see a goal, continue to implement the tribal water quality monitoring plan. So that was an annual objective, was to continue implementing the water quality monitoring program in accordance with their QAP. And then we also went through his base work plan, his 319 base work plan as well. And we extracted objectives from here. And then those got placed into the EPA-Tribal Environmental Plan. So here's kind of your first look of what the EPA-Tribal Environmental Plan looks like. And as I developed theirs, I kept track of where the source of the objectives were. So this is the initial source and obviously can be updated on an ongoing basis. So let's go to 106, for instance. We'll filter out just those objectives that I got from the fiscal year 16-17 work plan and see those. And so, we have develop a wellhead protection plan, submit quarterly reports, obtain training, conduct semi-annual macroinvertebrate and periphyton sampling, conduct quarterly water quality sampling monitoring analysis. So all those objectives were the ones that I extracted from 106. And so by using this drop-down menu, you can see that I got ones from the 319 work plans, from GAP. They have a tribal wildlife grants. There's some management plans, so the Southwest Willow Flycatcher Management Plan. So whatever documents I extracted objectives from, I try to keep track of the source so that Dave could refer back to those as needed, but just to know where they came from. So in some cases, this annual objective doesn't have sufficient level of detail. He may need to go back to look at that plan to see some of the steps to accomplish this annual objective. I also extracted objectives from other documents, such as resource management plans. So I mentioned before that resource management plans, assessments, strategic plans, land use plans, other information can have relevant objectives and goals in it. And I'll get to goals in a moment, but I focused on the objectives first. So an example here is Paula's Integrated Solid Waste Management Plan. In this case, scrolling down to page 36, the conclusion preferred scenario includes some objectives that were referred to elsewhere. So they weren't as extensive as I probably would like to see in terms of like what the consultant who prepared this for them developed. I would actually do a table that included objectives kind of similar to the ETEP strategic work plan. And that's actually how when I work on resource management plans for tribes, I include a table of at least 4 years worth of objectives by year, which then can be copied and pasted into their ETEP strategic work plan. I've been working with some other tribes on developing resource management plans that do have objectives that can be easily inserted into their ETEP. But these are examples of objectives that could be incorporated into the plan if they were appropriate. I think this plan was a little older, and so that a lot of these things had already been accomplished, so we didn't actually include any of these into the PED's ETEP strategic work plan. This is just an example. I opened this document, scanned through it, went immediately to where I would find the goals and objectives, and then pulled those out. And then asked Shasta about them. What's the status of these objectives? Have they been accomplished? Do you want to incorporate them into your ETEP strategic work plan? I also extracted potential objectives, annual objectives and milestones from the GAP guidebook. So that's Appendix 1 of the GAP guidance. I'll show you that in just a moment. And these are the indicators of tribal environmental program capacity. Those are kind of written in past tense as if they've been accomplished. They can be rewritten into future tense as if you're going to accomplish them. So I went through those for each program area that was relevant and found ones that I thought would may be applicable that Dave or Shasta may want to pursue, and made some recommendations. I also extracted or made recommendations of intermediate objectives and milestones that based on my experience in working on tribal environmental programs, on developing ETEPs for other clients, on working on resource management plans and doing other program development work. I've worked on a lot of tribal environmental programs, have an extensive amount of experience, and was able to pull from that experience to make some recommendations. So first of all, here's the gap guidance. And here's an example. Here are the indicators of capacity from which I extracted some potential objectives that the tribe may want to pursue. The great thing about the gap guidance capacity indicators is that these are gap eligible. Doesn't mean you'll necessarily get funding if you request it, but they're at least eligible for gap funding. These can be retranslated into objectives. So let me find a pretty good one. So right here, written policies and procedures for protecting sensitive tribal, environmental, and human health data. So this was rewritten as an objective as develop written procedures, policies and procedures protecting sensitive tribal, environmental, and human health data. That was a way, I probably proposed this potential objective to both Shasta and Dave to see if they wanted to pursue it, because it's just something they may want to pursue, and it's gap eligible because it's in the gap guidance. I would typically start off, I would either say these things to them over the phone, or I would send them an email with a list of the potential objectives. So here's an example of one I sent to Shasta for 2 program areas. I would tend to send, a couple at a time, actually multiple program areas. So I sent a list of objectives, potential objectives to Shasta, and told her to highlight them different colors. So green means like definitely proceed, yellow meant like maybe, red meant definitely not. So she went through these, highlighted them, and then sent them back to me. And the next step was extrapolating or fleshing out the objectives for the remaining years. So from the information I already gathered, usually could develop about 25 to 50% of the plan, develop most of the goals, or most of the objectives for the first 2 years of the plan, out of the 4 years of the plan. And then from there, extrapolated the remaining objectives for the remaining years. So we have years 1 and 2 covered by the work plans and by the resource management plans. And then there's a natural flow to these objectives. So based on what was in those years 1 and 2, which you already have, so that's the beautiful thing about this process, is you already have the foundation of this plan. And then from there, you're just adding to it. You're doing the natural, okay, what's the next step? We've done this in years 1 and 2. What do we do the following years after that? So let me show you an example. This is YANEPD's plan, and under the climate program area, an example of an objective that can be fleshed out was that Dave and his staff wanted to conduct a climate change vulnerability and risk assessment and prepare a report in fiscal year 2018. So the next natural step after that is down here is to develop a climate change adaptation / preparedness plan. So pretty easy to identify what the next step in that process is, what the next step is going to be, or the next objective for the next year. And then in fiscal year 2020, begin a climate change adaptation / preparedness program and pilot the implementation of this program and plan. So I don't know what those objectives from that plan will be because we haven't developed the plan, but we have a placeholder here to begin implementation in fiscal year 2020. Another thing I want to point out real quick is as we would discuss some objectives, in some cases they weren't prepared to commit to pursuing them at this time. So we listed those as possible objectives. It keeps them on the radar for future years. So when they're doing the annual review, they can decide whether to reincorporate these objectives and assign them a year or not. So, this one right here, develop a GIS database for climate change related information. They're not quite prepared to commit to that yet, but maybe in the future they'll change this to pursuing in 2022 or something. So another example of fleshing out an objective is under waste management. So one objective here was to, actually let's pull the category up. It's under regulating. It was actually developing laws. So finalize and adopt tribal waste code and regulations that address illegal dumping, open burning, junk vehicles, and other solid and hazardous waste issues. So that's an objective for 2018. 2019, The natural objective following that is to develop, test, and evaluate tribal waste law enforcement and compliance monitoring policies, procedures, and forms. So this is the implementation of that law that's been developed. That will be done in the following year. And then after that, implementing those waste law enforcement compliance and compliance monitoring policies, procedures, and forms is the annual objective for the next year. So it's actually fairly straightforward to flesh these things out and to complete the entire plan. And then from there, or at some point, I'd add repeating and common objectives. Since most of the work that environmental tribal offices do is ongoing and repetitive, most of the ETEP strategic work plans will consist of repeating annual and common objectives. So let me just show you an example from the PED's ETEP strategic work plan. So under their water program area, you see a lot of objectives that are repeated year in and year out. So pursuing funding, that's an annual objective. That requires resources to do. You want to keep it on your radar. You need to be doing that every single year. Education and outreach, you're doing every single year. Water quality monitoring, you're continuing to do every single year. So some common objectives are things like pursuing funding, reporting. That's a common objective. Common objective means that it applies to pretty much every program area. So every program area probably is going to require some funding. Every program area is probably going to require some level of reporting. Most are probably going to require education and outreach. It's really easy to plug those in and then copy and paste them for future years. So if you go through the future years one, you'll see collaboration, the education outreach, funding, wetlands, annually reviewing the QAP. So a lot of these are repeat year in and year out. Some of them are more of an evolution. So developing a management plan, implementing a management plan, that's going to be something where you're going to see some differences from year to year. And obviously you can add more detail if you want. I do think it's important to keep these objectives fairly concise and straightforward. You want to keep them on your radar. You can always go elsewhere to gather more information. I find that the biggest problem for most organizations, not just tribal environmental departments, is that it's easy to lose track of what you're trying to accomplish, and it's easy to lose track of what the overall goals are. All right, so then we had the process of developing the long-term goals per program area, and I'll show some of these real quick. Here are the YANEPD's long-term program area goals. We have them for air, climate, education outreach, general natural resources. So all the program areas have at least one, more likely 2 to 5 long-term program area goals. So a long-term program area goal under water would be minimize or eliminate point source pollution impacts on surface waters, groundwaters, and sensitive habitats. I personally like to have goals that don't necessarily have specific numerical targets because I think those are more targets than goals. This is an ongoing goal. Minimizing and eliminating point source pollution is an ongoing goal. That's something that's always going to guide your office. And it's unlikely you'll actually achieve eliminating that pollution, but you want to continue to strive to do so. I really extracted the long-term goals using the same process that I did for the objectives. It's just they were more concise. I didn't have, like, the goals themselves weren't designated by year. They're ongoing. So, I pulled them from work plans, from resource management plans, in some cases from the GAP guidebook, from my knowledge, from Prosper Sustainably's knowledge base. And then I drafted long-term program area goals. I find that the long-term program area goals don't vary that much between tribal environmental departments that are managing similar programs. So that water goal that I just mentioned probably applies to every single tribal environmental program that has a water program. Both the PED and YANEPD went through a strategic planning process. This is optional, but it is recommended. And this covers the mission, vision, values, SWOT analysis, so going through strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And then there was some overlap between the long-term program area goals and objectives. So this process began in both cases with a strategic planning survey. So I went through and asked questions. I submitted a questionnaire about mission, vision, and values to all of the staff from each department, and they answered these questions. And then the next kind of major step was conducting a full-day strategic planning retreat. So we did a one-day strategic planning retreat where we reviewed mission, vision, values, goals, and objectives, did a SWOT analysis. We reviewed this questionnaire as well. And here's a sample agenda of what we went through for that. So really just what I talked about, and spent a good amount of time most of the afternoon focusing on the program, those annual objectives. So everything that went through in that spreadsheet, I actually converted into a Word document. So this is the environmental emergencies program areas, description of the program area, the long-term goals, and then all the objectives for this particular program area. So there's a process. I have a training video on it on how to copy and paste the objectives into a Word document so that you can go in here and then you can actually make edits using track changes. So you think you'll go back and edit the strategic work plan spreadsheet if you want. So you can go through here and highlight things and make changes to it without actually impacting the spreadsheet. And then once those changes are approved by the supervisor or whoever needs to approve them, then you can go back and edit them in the spreadsheet. And you can use this for staff members who don't want to work on the spreadsheet or who need to kind of build on their spreadsheet skills. But you actually don't want all of your staff members working on the spreadsheet because it's hard to keep track of the changes. This is a way to make changes. So you could delete something and just say, let's say we want to eliminate. We don't even want to minimize, eliminate. So you want to keep track of what those changes are going to be, and then somebody will make those changes in the spreadsheet. Then from the information gathered from the questionnaire and the strategic planning retreat, I drafted and finalized the mission, vision, values, program area goals. In some cases, the tribe, I think both tribes actually already did have a mission. I don't think either had a vision statement. So I drafted that. I recrafted their vision based on what they stated in the questionnaire and during the retreat. So mind you, I'm developing their ETEP strategic work plan with all of this based on all of the information they have, all of their feedback. This is their information. It's all coming from them. So I drafted those, and let me pull up an example. So this is the Paula Environmental Department's mission and vision, and then their core values. I like the core value of passion, and the statement that we believe that what we do is pretty freaking cool. This originally was in a Word document. I more recently put it straight into the spreadsheet because it just made more sense to have it in one location. So this was, part of the results of the process, as well as reviewing all of this information in this spreadsheet as well, in Word documents as opposed to in the spreadsheet directly. Before reviewing or circulating the final draft plan, we added the authorized environmental program. So that I talked about that before. So that's just the table at the bottom of the spreadsheet. This indicates whether the tribe has any plans to manage EPA statutory programs or environmental statutory programs under the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, so on and so forth. So basically, if that is the case, it just says see objectives. Then you go to the objectives and you'll see what TAS authority or what delegable responsibility the tribe wants to assume. Otherwise, it says not applicable or none at this time. The full ETEP strategic work plan was then circulated using the Word document cut sheets rather than the actual spreadsheet itself. The director or manager would review the spreadsheet, but otherwise we created cut sheets for each program area and then circulated these to staff and had them edit these using track changes. And then those are finalized. We also needed so we finalized those, added the plans to manage authorized environmental programs, circulated it, obtained and incorporated final staff feedback. Reviewed the EPA documents. This included, for at least EPA Region 9, the inventory of regulated facilities and EPA's areas of involvement. So I'm showing you Paula's ones they received from the EPA. So the EPA provides the other documents you need. And you review these, you provide them feedback. I found in I think both cases there really wasn't any changes that need to be made. So these are the regulated facilities. And they take that from their public database, so that's all public information. And then they also prepared this areas of involvement document. And so these are part of once they're finalized by both the tribe and the EPA, they're part of the plan, but these were drafted by the EPA. So these documents, the full ETEP package minus the cover letter, were submitted to the EPA, who then reviewed the process. So at this point, I can unmute you, Shasta. So you submitted your plan in fiscal year 2015. What month did you submit it? Or actually, you submitted it in, I think, first quarter fiscal year 2016, November, October, correct?
That sounds about right.
And when did you receive the cover letter? When was that completed?
The cover letter took some time, and it was only in the last month that we got the final version of the cover letter for our chairman's signature.
Okay, so it took a bit of time. And since you submitted the plan, that was 2015. So yeah, it could take a while. So that's kind of the main thing is for the EPA to review this plan and then provide you the final cover letter, that can take some time. And then who signed the document, the cover letter for the EPA?
It was Laura Ebert, but I had a choice. We had a choice. We were asked, who do you want to sign it? And we could go as high as the region administrator, and we didn't think that was necessary. So we just asked for Laura to sign it.
Okay, and Laura Ebert's the Region Nine's GAP program manager.
Yes, yes.
And so you have the choice. And then who signed it for the tribe?
Our chairman.
Okay, and that was basically just determined by you as a tribe who was the appropriate person to sign, not so much by the EPA, correct?
Yeah, that was definitely, it was our choice.
Okay. And then I think, Dave, you had a similar process. You submitted yours last quarter of fiscal year 2015 and 16, I believe. And then you're waiting to hear back. So it's been about 6 months or so. I mean, I think you also had the kind of same choice. You're also in Region 9, and then you mentioned that your chairwoman is going to sign. All right, so I'm going to try to breeze through the process of implementing. All right, so with the Paula tribe, we've been working on this for a little longer than with YANEPD because we started a year earlier. We just completed our annual review updates. So we did the annual strategic plan review meeting. So this was the second retreat. We did this, I think, last October, where we re-reviewed the mission, vision, values, goals, objectives, all these things, and we got some feedback. So one thing that was helpful in this case was we reviewed and obtained feedback on the objectives using the cut sheets, and we were in the process of updating the plan, adding the additional year to the plan, and archiving the year that's passed. So by going through this process once a year, PED does never need to do a major update. They just do these annual updates, and the plan's always covering the next 4 years. So both the PED and the NAPD use their ETEP strategic work plans to develop their GAP 106, 319, and other grant work plans. So, you all know what those look like, and they basically just copied and pasted their objectives, not entirely. They would sometimes recraft them, but essentially their work plans for the next fiscal year was already there. So they didn't need to kind of recreate it, and it was moving forward as opposed to just kind of recycling the same components and commitments again and again. So PED's done this for 2 years now, fiscal year 17 and then fiscal year 2018. And then the NAPD did this for the first time for their fiscal year 2018 work plans. So both have added staff member and external responsibilities to their strategic work plan spreadsheets. So here's an example here of what that looks like. This is the NAPD's strategic work plan. And then these acronyms with the primary and secondary responsibilities are for different staff members. So EM is environmental manager, ESV is environmental supervisor, ES is environmental specialist, and then we have some external responsibilities. So in this case, KA is contract attorney. And then there's kind of a cool feature built into the enhanced spreadsheet. So one thing I want to point out is the versions that both Dave and Shasta are working off of are enhanced spreadsheet versions that have been modified over time. There are more simple versions that don't have these drop-downs, that don't have these features. But I have also tried to create these drop-down lists and provided trainings on how to modify them so that they're as user-friendly as possible. So kind of a cool thing here is if you add an additional responsibility, it pops up in this box right here. If I delete that, it goes away. So that automatically populates. And then, you add hours, they translate into work years. So what was helpful is the PED had filled out these responsibilities in their ETEP strategic work plan. And then for their annual retreat, we were able to create staff-specific cut sheets. So we had cut sheets for each staff member that just included the objectives that they were involved in. So here's an example. We have the air technician's cut sheet right here. So this is all of the objectives that air technician AT is involved in, either as a primary responsibility or secondary responsibility. So the air technician can review the objectives that he just has for the next 4 years and provide feedback on those, make edits using track changes, keep track of those, which then can be incorporated into the plan. So this is also going to be used for monthly meetings as well. So I'm in the process of working with both Shasta and Dave on conducting regular individual staff member strategy meetings, ideally monthly. We're hopefully going to start these within the next few months, where they meet with their staff members one-on-one each month and review their cut sheets for the next 2 years. So their cut sheet will include the objectives for the current fiscal year and the next fiscal year. They'll discuss where they are at with these things so everybody stays on the same page. And, as they need additional resources or assistance, they can request that from their supervisor or director or whoever it is. And that's the most powerful aspect of this. That turns this into a strategic management system rather than just a strategic plan that's likely going to kind of sit on the shelf. And then there's some instructions. So there's training videos that are being created for that process. And here's actually the written instructions that I've been developing for that as well. So there's meeting preparation steps and 6 different parts. There's meeting preparation by the staff member and the supervisor. The steps during the meeting, and then there's post-meeting steps, including updating the ETEP strategic work plan after you've made edits to those cut sheets. So again, you make edits to the cut sheets using track changes, then you don't have to worry about somebody editing the spreadsheet and not knowing what those changes were or not having those changes be approved. So, and then it's easier to circulate those Word documents. You also can write on those cut sheets instead of, you can print them out and write on them instead. And so these ETEP strategic work plan templates, the spreadsheets, or whatever form you use for the PED and YANEPD, they have been customized and upgraded with additional features. So one thing I want to point out, I think I already showed those drop-down menus, but I'll just pull these open. So most of the columns have drop-down menus. They make it so that you can't, you have the same language being used. You need filter and sort, which is a very user-friendly or powerful tool. Everything needs to be spelled the same way. It needs to have the same spaces. There's drop downs embedded into this, which can be edited as well. Even getting over to the staff members themselves, those are all drop downs. You have the staff list already here. You just select it. That makes it a lot easier to use, a lot more user friendly, and it ensures consistency that you need for quick filtering and sorting. We've integrated annual training, education, and outreach and funding plans. So these can get pretty detailed. If you list every single training that a staff member is going to be pursuing into the objectives portion of this plan, it's just going to make it too lengthy, as well as, you don't want to enter every event in an educational outreach activity or every grant proposal you're going to pursue in the objectives portion, because you just want those to be annual objectives that are more streamlined. So the plan itself includes tables for those. So you have those in a separate table to track. I already showed you the inventory of important information and documents. And then I've been working with Dave in incorporating budget and expense tracking. So let me show you some of these features in Dave's. Here's an annual training plan. We still need to work on fleshing this out, but here are some trainings that we've entered for this fiscal year. And the tab itself, it talks about which fiscal year the training plan is applicable to. Here's the education outreach plan. Again, we still need to flesh this out. This is all still a bit of a work in progress. Funding opportunities that are going to be pursued next fiscal year, some relevant information. You can keep track of current funding sources if you want. This has some of the funding sources. This department does have more. And as I mentioned, the budget and expense tracking. So this spreadsheet right here has the monthly expenses for. We're working on fleshing this out right now. I just created this spreadsheet for Dave, and I'm going to have him fill out the rest of it through the end of February or March. And so we have the monthly expenses and revenues, the year to date, we have the total budget, and the variance this is for PPG, and then the budget remaining. We also have, this automatically calculates the fringe rates, so on a monthly basis and then on an annual basis, which can be helpful for your grant proposal preparation. Now I'm going to turn it over to Shasta, who's going to share her perspective on the ETEP goals, benefits, and objectives.
Okay. So thank you, Josh. And I'm just going to give you guys a little bit of perspective from our side, what it was like going through this process. But the first thing I want to say is that what he's just gone through might seem a little bit overwhelming because he's trying to synthesize many months worth of work into a single list of goals and achievements. So if you're looking at that and feeling a little bit overwhelmed, if you haven't started on your TEP or your ETEP and you're feeling like, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to get this done? It's not as complicated as you think. And having all of these tools and resources available that are already done, these blank forms that you can fill in with your own information, is very, very helpful. And even if you're a person like me, and I refer to Excel as my kryptonite, I am not good with Excel. Even I know enough about Excel to be able to type something into a cell and have a list of my goals and objectives. So that's one of the very helpful things about this process, and having it in this format is that it puts everything you need right there at your fingertips. And ultimately, I think one of the most helpful things, if I had to pick one thing, is that it cuts the amount of time that it takes to develop your work plans for your grants, at least in half, if not more, because you've already got everything figured out. And if you're at all like me, then your middle name is procrastinate. And knowing that you can work on this and it's there for you, it's not that it helps you procrastinate, but you've already spent time putting it together when you're not on the pressure of a deadline. So when it comes time to submit that new work plan, whether it's for GAP or some other program that you have money for, it makes it a lot easier and it relieves a lot of that stress because you know you've thought about it. And especially with the strategic planning portion of it, whether you have a staff like mine with 9 people or it's just you and one other person, putting your heads together and deciding what is your vision, what is your mission, what are your goals, is a great way to outline your future and to have something to put into that document that's not just existing in your head, it's something that exists in that document for you to refer to. And I found that even though I've been doing this job now for over 6 years, that the experience of the strategic planning day where we all sat together and brainstormed our ideas, I learned things about my staff that I never otherwise would have known. So if you have the ability to do that, even if it's just you and one person or you and a whole bunch of people, or if you want to invite somebody who's a stakeholder, maybe members of the tribal community or your leadership team, to get involved in that strategic planning, I think that that's very helpful because you're all thinking about what your needs are going to be moving forward. Another aspect of it that might have some people feeling anxious is the fact that in order to still qualify for our GAP funding, all of the tribes have to have one of these on file with EPA, and the deadline for that is coming up pretty quickly. So you might be thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I don't have the time. One of the most important things you can do is reach out early to your project officer. And if you are considering going in this direction with using this kind of a format with the spreadsheet and with Excel, talk to them early, because I found that my initial project officer, I've now switched to somebody else, but she was kind of uneasy because I think she was even less familiar with Excel than I am. And she was expecting to see some sort of a narrative format that she could print out and put in a 3-ring binder. And it took some time to get her to come around to the spreadsheet version of the TEP. And she ultimately realized that it's a much more helpful tool than just something you print out and punch holes in and then, as Josh mentioned, ends up sitting on a shelf gathering dust. So talk to your project officer and make sure that they also understand that it is up to the tribe what format they choose for their TEP and their ETEP. It's not up to EPA. It says in the GAP guidance that it is up to the tribe. So make sure you've got that in your corner if you have a project officer who seems a little bit reluctant to go in this direction. You want to be able to point to where that is your right as a tribe to be able to fill it out the way you want to and develop it the way you want to. And if that project officer is still giving you some resistance, then don't be afraid to ask them to talk to somebody else, perhaps a project officer from another region that has gone through this already with their tribes and has embraced and accepted the usefulness of this particular version of your TEP or your ETEP.
Let me just cut in real quick on that, because ultimately I think that part of that happened because you submitted a draft initially that was the spreadsheet, but ultimately what you submitted was actually the Word document cut sheets that just had the essential information. Ultimately, your project officer did receive this in a Word. It was in a table format, but it was actually in a Word document. And I think that was part of some of the initial reluctance and confusion was when she got the spreadsheet, she had no idea what was up and down. That's actually another recommendation too, is that if you do talk to your project officer early, let them know they're going to receive a Word document that has just the key information. This spreadsheet that I showed you, there's only a fraction of it needs to be submitted to the EPA. The rest of it is for you to manage as a strategic management system for your department. So I've developed that process for you all and helped you develop those cut sheets that just has the objectives, basically has the program areas, the long-term goals, and then the objectives without any additional information beyond that in the plans to manage authorized programs. So it's really like the first 2 or 3 columns in the spreadsheet are the only ones that actually need to go to the EPA.
Yeah, so good point. I had forgotten that we had submitted it as partially as a Word document with tables, because I'm just remembering that it was a little bit of a struggle to to get her to come around. But my current project officer, she immediately recognized the usefulness of having it in this format. And so I think that it just depends on who your individual project officer is. But I just want to circle back to the beginning of my comments. If you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by this and thinking, oh my gosh, I'm never going to be able to do everything, it seems like it's so much. A lot of this work, if you're working with Josh and with his format, a lot of this work has already been done for you. So it's just a matter of gathering the information. And not everybody's is going to be as detailed and complex as what we have, because I'm fortunate. I have a big staff and a lot of the ability to do a lot of different projects. You might just have 3 or 4 major areas that you want to focus on, and that's going to make things a lot easier. So don't be overwhelmed. It's just like anything, it starts with that first step and it gets easier as you go along. Nobody expects you to be able to do it all just in a single sitting. It does take time, but having help is really, really vital. And then my final point is that we do have things in there, as Josh mentioned, that aren't part of EPA. And I want to highlight the fact that we have our TIPO office as part of our environmental department. And I think that unfortunately, the Environmental Protection Agency, they don't understand that when it comes to tribal nations, it's difficult to separate the cultural from the natural, because the natural environment itself is part of the culture and is part of tradition, and in many cases is part of the sacred. So for us, it's obvious that you need to have those things integrated into your plan. I would recommend that if you have that kind of relationship already in your tribe where your environmental department is also dealing with cultural, include it. And then hopefully at some point in the future, EPA will recognize that it should be allowable to have environmental issues also overlap with cultural issues when it comes to managing our tribal environments. And last thing, if anybody has any personal questions for me about my experience, I'm sure Josh can send you my contact information, and I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants to one-on-one.
Thank you very much, Shasta. I really, really appreciate your input, and it just as always, it's been a pleasure working with you in this process. You and Dave both been embracing this and maximizing the value of it. So appreciate your feedback. Dave, you ready to talk and share your experience?
Yeah, I got a few words to say. The thing that I've always been looking for is some kind of a tool or a way to be more efficient regarding all the work that we're now tasked to do. Before it was just a gap. Now we have the 106, the 319. We have other work plans that we're doing. And so having it all combined into one useful tool makes it more efficient as far as having all your information in just Excel. When you're doing your gap work plan for like solid waste or for pesticides or for air quality or climate change, you have everything is separate. So I have everything organized on the computer by year, by grant, by category. And so that makes it difficult. And then the spreadsheets for the budgets are separate. So allowing to have it all together and then adding other supporting documents like narratives and other supporting information that needs to be submitted for like a grant application or a proposal, that makes it more efficient. So I don't have to go looking for all these different documents from the previous year. I can go in there and I can pull them out. And so having the convenience of having all of this in one location, that saves a lot of time. And having the goals and objectives from all the important documents and notes in one place, sometimes I'll have all these papers on my desk, and trying to go back into that particular document makes it kind of difficult to try to find. So this makes it much more efficient. And you're able to look at the work that you did previously. So my gap, because it's online, your previous years, you have to go out, you have to go back into that particular work plan, or you have to go pull it out of the folder and look at it in a hard copy. This, you have it already there as far as the work that you've previously done. So to me, that makes it much more efficient and saves a lot of time. Like Shasta had said, if you want to ask me any questions or any information that you might need, I'm always willing to share all that. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Really appreciate your input. And again, working with you on this has been great. I appreciate that you've been kind of pushing me to add more features and more information to this to make it more useful to you. So this whole thing has kind of been user driven as well. Working with Dave and Shasta and some of the other tribal environmental programs out there has helped me to craft this into something that truly is useful in, and I'm continuing to improve the templates and the process over time. So thanks, Shasta and Dave. I want to just finish up by going through the services and trainings and some other information, kind of some of the benefits of working with Prosper. I want to conclude, answer some of the questions that I've received. So there's been a few questions. So Prosper Sustainably offers various services and trainings. There are free webinars, templates, and other resources available. So some of these are already available online. I'm going to be posting this webinar. You can go to my website, prospersustainably.com/resources/tribal, and this is usually where I post most of the resources available for tribes, those related to ETEPs and strategic planning, and those that are related to other projects as well. So you can click on this link right there, and you can see the various times I've done presentations and other resources that I have available. So be forwarding the templates to you all who've registered for this training. So that also include webinar recordings from some prior events that I've done as well, and presentations from some of the workshops and stuff that I've conducted. I also mentioned the templates that I'm going to be sharing with you all. You've seen the enhanced template. There's also a simplified template that I'm going to share that doesn't have the drop-down menus, that just has the essential information. So, I'll scroll up. This has just the essential tables in it and just like the key information. So this is really things you actually need to have in terms of like meeting the EPA's requirements for ETEPs. I think just these key boxes. So this is the time frame. This is the objective. They may not be requiring capacity indicator numbers anymore. I've kind of heard different things on that. The role, and that's really just whether it's the tribe or the EPA or both, the particular program area that it applies to. And you can add some notes and links, which you don't even need to submit to the EPA. But then you still have your long-term program area goals, and then you have the short description of the program areas. And then all the way down at the bottom, you have the plans to manage authorized environmental programs. So very simple spreadsheet. I have two Word versions. So there's one that's a table that looks similar to the spreadsheets themselves. So all I kind of did was copy and paste the tables into here, and you can just kind of add more rows and add more tables as needed. The one difference is that there's a different table for each program area rather than having the program areas listed, because you don't really have the sorting features available, and I removed the links. So just this is even more just the essential information. And then I have kind of a bulleted list version of it as well. So I really think these should be working documents. That's why I didn't really create them as narrative documents. Like, these are things that you want to continue to update and modify that can guide you on an ongoing basis. This one actually has some instructions in it, and all you would do is just delete the instructions and insert information according to the instructions and according to what's already in there. So there is an ETEP online course that I first released last year in the spring of 2016. It's a fee-based course. It includes a core course with 8 modules. I'm adding supplemental and advanced trainings to it all the time. So the core course is more focused on the development process. It included strategic planning as well as the ETEP development. It should be used as guidance. I've also been refining the process over time, so some of what I said then may not be the precise way I did it, but conceptually the concepts are there, and it explains what the requirements are, where it comes from, and how to meet those requirements as well. Here's a quick list of the courses. So there's the 8 module courses, and then there's all these advanced trainings on how to use different aspects of either the spreadsheet or just do different things, create cut sheets. And then we have the staff member training series. It's going to be published within the next week or so as well. As I work with clients on implementing these things, I'm creating training videos to them, and I'm kind of doing it in a way where they're generic training videos that can be available to those who purchase the course. One thing I want to point out is that anybody who does contract with Prosper Sustainably to develop an ETEP does get free access to the full course at no additional cost. And that's more lifetime access, where this is a 2-year access with a training fee. I mentioned the in-person ETEP trainings and workshops. So Prosper Sustainably can be hired to conduct training or workshop. So I've mainly done one day. I can do multiple day ones as well. And then the ETEP development and implementation consulting services. So the benefits of working with Prosper are that the strategic planning and management expertise that Prosper has developed over time. You really want your ETEP to be a living, adaptable, and highly useful strategic planning and management system. Otherwise, you're just doing it to check off your box for the EPA. And I think a lot of tribes probably see it that way, and that's unfortunate, where I think this can be seen as really a valuable tool that hopefully you'd want to do anyways. I had this process streamlined to quickly and easily develop an ETEP strategic work plan. One that optimizes your department's operations, going to keep your department remain in alignment, keep your staff on track, and help your department minimize your resources for maximum effectiveness in achieving your tribe's environmental goals. So the extensive experience and knowledge database that Prosper Sustainably has means that we can help you fill in the gaps. I've worked on a lot of different programs, and so I can identify where your program can go. So it's not that I'm going to decide where it will go. I'll just present you with opportunities based on my work and my experience and the prior ETEPs and knowledge database that Prosper Sustainably has. The ETEP strategic work plan flows into a streamlined and effective implementation system. So that's what makes it a management system, not just a planning system, but a management system that's going to help your department on an ongoing basis. The goal is to help you all be self-sufficient. So implementing this strategic planning and management system can take some time, but once you commit that time and you kind of work these things out, then your department will be humming. And then you're kind of creating a turnover-proof department. You have your goals and objectives there. You can show them to somebody new comes in, you can show them your goals and objectives. Your director changes, your manager changes, your specialist change. Plan is still intact. And Prosper Sustainably is available to assist with updates and implementation as needed. So I do want tribes to be self-sufficient. It can take time to develop and implement this process, but then as things evolve and change, you can contact Prosper Sustainably to help you with that, or implementation of specific programs. So we do other work as well. There's complementary trainings, resources, and other services. So Prosper Sustainably does resource management plans, environmental code development, grant writing, feasibility studies, program development, etc. You can go on our website and go on our services to see more. And I mentioned before that our resource management plans are designed with 4-year action plans that integrate with your tribal environmental plan. So they have tables that you can copy and paste into your ETEP strategic work plan. So before I conclude, one final closing thought. I encourage you all, if you're interested in registering for the ETEP trainings, want a proposal or cost estimate for ETEP development and implementation services, or are interested in any of Prosper Sustainably's other services, please email me or give me a call. In conclusion, before we move on to questions, I just want to say that I believe that the approach taken by the Paula Tribe and Yavapai Apache Nation, which was designed by Prosper Sustainably, is the best way to develop and implement an ETEP. While I am admittedly biased, I hope that these case studies showed how useful and effective this ETEP methodology can be. The Paula and Yavapai Apache ETEPs are more than just ETEPs. They are comprehensive yet streamlined strategic planning and management systems. They are also living and adaptable tools that can guide their respective tribal environmental departments and their staffs for decades or more into the future. Both Shasta and David said to me that they would adopt the system even if ETEPs weren't an EPA requirement. And I think that's been demonstrated by their continued use and hiring of me to continue to implement these systems. So this is what I believe you should expect your ETEP to be. Thank you very much. I'm going to take some time for questions. As I mentioned, so Dallas Caldwell from St. Regis Mohawk said that their tribe is implementing a 10-year strategic plan and their air program has been developing for the past 10 or 20 years. The question is how can I make our 10-year plan look ambitious when we're more or less maintaining what we have now? There will be possible new projects in the future, but things are uncertain right now. That's a very good question. I actually don't recommend putting a 10-year plan. I think keeping a plan be more concise, more an ongoing 4 or 5-year plan is more manageable, because once you get beyond 5 years, things are a lot more fuzzy. Like, it's hard to predict what's going to happen then. And a lot of things you're doing are repetitive. So showing that you're doing ongoing air quality monitoring, gathering data, developing these new systems, you need to actually continue to do your air quality monitoring in order to report that data to the EPA, so they have that information they can post online to show that you're in compliance. So some things will be repetitive, and that's great. But just showing from year to year that you're updating your management plans, you're implementing your management plans, you're upgrading your data management systems. You can show that as an annual objective, and somebody can see that. And I think somebody will be more impressed if they see that you have a manageable, living, adaptable plan than seeing some very lengthy, detailed plan that looks extremely ambitious but it's not likely to be achieved. So if you have a system that you're using that's guiding you on a daily and an ongoing basis, then somebody's going to trust your plan, where most paper documents just sit on a shelf, or long documents or extensive plans sit on a shelf and not actually referred to. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, great. So I really want to thank Dave and Shasta for participating and sharing their input, and I want to thank all of you. So thank you very much. I appreciate it, and feel free to reach out to me at any time.